Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Sir Hunt on X on this Thursday night, the 21st of August of the calendar year 2025, as I come to you live from Cincinnati, Ohio, in the United States of America on a gorgeous 80-degree night with a nice cool breeze that gone through. Hope everyone had themselves a wonderful day today and lots of wonderful days among many others to come as the fall weather approaches. Of course, it is football season coming up, but tonight is a historical perspective and one of the more glamorous nights, maybe in sports history. We talk about little big men, and tonight will be devoted to that particular night, and we just touch on his history and where this event talks among some of the great events among little giants. It was 44 years ago today at the indoor pavilion at Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas, Nevada, where it was the two little giants, Salvador Sanchez and Wilfredo Gomez, colliding in one of the premier little big men matchups in one of the premier rivalries when you think in the sport of boxing, at least internationally, the rivalry of Mexico versus Puerto Rico. Its deep tradition, its deep passion, among many others, and it basically is one of the landmark moments in that history of that rivalry, especially in that sport south of the middleweight division. And when we talk about this particular night, it basically is a crux in the middle of that particular rivalry. And you're talking about two outstanding Latin American fighters looking to put themselves among the upper echelon of all-time great Latin American fighters, and at least to be considered the greatest of their respective countries. Salvador Sanchez being from Mexico, and of course, Wilfredo Gomez being from Puerto Rico. When you talk about this particular fight in the build-up, you had the calm and charm of Salvador Sanchez, and the wits, basically low-key arrogance and almost cockiness of Wilfredo Gomez, colliding for the elite prize at the time, the featherweight championship of the world. Wilfredo Gomez has started to build his mark as a guy who was basically wiping everybody out, because going into this particular fight, he won all 32 of his fights by knockout, and basically he was fighting at a higher weight class coming down, and was a favorite going into this fight with the all-time stand-up Mexican Salvador Sanchez. Because the question was going to be what happens when Sanchez faces a guy who can hit as a caliber of a Wilfredo Gomez, who is one of the premier punchers in that division, especially when you talk about what Wilfredo Gomez did to the likes of fighters like Carlos Zarate and Lupe Pintor prior to this, other Mexican fighters in the middle of that Mexican-Puerto Rican rivalry. And of course, we talk about Salvador Sanchez, one of the premier do-it-all fighters from south of the border in Mexico. And we talk about Salvador Sanchez, counterpuncher, the ability to defend, who can time you perfectly with counter left hooks. And of course, a chin that doesn't get talked about enough, like none other, which I'll touch on when I break down this fight here in a minute. But you're talking about the relaxed calm of Salvador Sanchez, one of the premier do-it-all fighters of that time, against an Wilfredo Gomez who was just plowing through everyone just based on sheer will and determination and with unreal power for a fighter in those weight classes at that time. Because power punches weren't even thought of when we talk about the featherweight division. And Wilfredo Gomez was one of the rare of its kind, excuse me. And basically, you're talking about the dueling battles of Mexico and Puerto Rico, the dueling passions of the respective countries and fan bases when it comes to this particular nights and this particular fights. When you talk about Mexico versus Puerto Rico, I'll touch on a boatload of those at the end of the show. But the main thing when you talk about Mexico versus Puerto Rico is you're going to have deep passion, you're going to have dueling salsa bands, and that's what this had with these two when they went at it, dueling salsa bands, Liberace bands, among many other things. Fans, basically just going at one another, Mexicans versus Puerto Ricans to defend their fighters. And it was basically a scene like none other than what took place 30 some odd years ago, 44 years ago at the indoor pavilion of Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas. And that's what you had when you talked about Salvador Sanchez versus Wilfredo Gomez. Gomez was as good as they come in that division. Sanchez, knocking on the door of greatness. And basically, as he was getting better, his resume was getting better. And basically, this guy was looking for the landmark moment to get over the top, to put himself among some of the elite fighters. We talk about the lower divisions in the pound-for-pound category. And he needed a guy like Gomez to get it. And the build-up for this, there's not much really to build up. We talk about Mexico versus Puerto Rico, because that's what this was. And this was the beef of what the Mexican-Puerto Rican rivalry was at the time, and we consider that Salvador Sanchez and Wilfredo Gomez were the kings of their countries at that time. And at that point, you could probably say that close to having the distinction of the greatest to ever come out of both Mexico and Puerto Rico, respectively. This had potential to be something special. But there was one problem going into this. All the approach of Wilfredo Gomez, basically say he didn't know much about Salvador Sanchez, wanted to test him, so he wanted to go after him. And you had a feeling it was going to play right into the hands of Salvador Sanchez, even though Gomez was surprisingly a favorite. I'm not going to read too much into favorites. I'm not into fight odds for what took place back in the 80s. But apparently Gomez was a favorite. Remember, he knocked everybody out. Everyone he brought in the ring, he knocked him out. And everybody thought Sanchez might be the next one on the list. So during the national anthems and the introductions, again, the craziness of Caesar's Palace was packed 5,000 in the indoor pavilion of that particular arena, which felt like 50,000 because it was wild, loud, and crazy when you consider how the deep followings from their countries Salvador Sanchez and Wilfredo Gomez had. And we talk about this particular fight that started out. Wilfredo Gomez said he was going to go after Salvador Sanchez and test him out. And early in the fight, he got off. He started out strong, looked like he was going to take control. A couple times he pinned Salvador Sanchez on the ropes, but Salvador Sanchez, being crafty as he is for a fighter at that age, did a heck of a job trying to wheel away and maneuver with the power of Gomez, who basically was trying to test Sanchez early. Even a couple times when Gomez landed those trademark left hooks, it looked like it wasn't going to bother Sanchez, even though Sanchez was on the ropes and Gomez was landing at will early on. It looked like he was going to take control. But as the round came to an end, after a 3-punch combination that opened up for Gomez, looked like he took control. A subtle mistake and a check hook by Sanchez puts Gomez on the seat of his pants to end round 1. And all of a sudden, there was a confident look on Wilfredo Gomez before he got hit. Now, after he got hit, a lot of things changed. Because it was from that point forward, the greatness of Salvador Sanchez took over. And I mean, it really took over. I mean, in a big fight of this magnitude, you thought maybe be some type of a even matchup, because that's what a lot of it was pegged. Little did we know, Salvador Sanchez had a bigger killer inside him than people thought. And boy, from the second round on, we started to have a beating. Because everything Gomez did, it was a precision counterpunching of Salvador Sanchez as the fight was going on, started to swell up both eyes, not one eye, both eyes of Wilfredo Gomez. And by the end of round 3, you thought Wilfredo Gomez's eyes were shaped of golf balls, because that's what happened to the end of round 3 when it comes to Wilfredo Gomez. Wilfredo Gomez starting to get beat up. Because anything he tried to do, Salvador Sanchez started to have an answer to it. His ability to control the ring, his ability to counterpunch, his ability to defend, and most importantly, his ability to take Wilfredo Gomez's punch and counter effectively the way he did, was what started to take the fight into Sanchez's control as the fight was wearing on. And you started to see the effects as he was gradually wearing down Wilfredo Gomez and starting to deliver a beating, because not only was his eye swollen up, but you're talking about a nose that got messed up. And every time Sanchez threw, he hit Gomez. And every time he hit Gomez, Gomez's face started to get beat up. Because from the second round, especially to the end of the 5th round, that's when it really started to tell, because Gomez could hardly even see. Now we fast forward to the 6th and 7th rounds. Once again, Gomez trying to implement himself, still a threat, because you're talking about a guy who's knocked out every fighter he's fought, which is what his record was with Wilfredo Gomez going in. Gomez is still trying, but he basically has no answers at this point, because every time he tries to hit Sanchez, Sanchez just dusts his off like it's nothing to him. And as every time Gomez tried to hit him, Sanchez would counter him, which has basically been the strong suit of Salvador Sanchez throughout his historically great career. It started to really add up, and every time he started to hit Gomez, he started to hurt Gomez. And this fight was starting to become a one-sided massacre like none other. It was not just a massacre like a total beatdown. It was a massacre of pure brilliance, a massacre of pure beauty, the ability to control the ring and ring generalship, defense, and effective punching was what Salvador Sanchez started to show as this fight was going on. And as this was going on, Wilfredo Gomez was starting to become very, very defenseless. So and again, the face of Gomez just started to show massive effects, and he was starting to take one of those kind of beatings you don't know how they was going to recover from. So we fast forward to the 8th round, and after a couple counter left hooks, again, had Wilfredo Gomez now seriously hurt. This time, Salvador Sanchez goes for the kill. The combination that put Gomez down on his knees, but Wilfredo Gomez, with the heart as big as the country of Puerto Rico, manages to pull himself up, but he wobbles into the arms of referee Carlos Padilla, and at that point, the fight is stopped. And in the landmark moment, the keystone moment of his career, the moment that put him into the top of all the fighters, especially in that those lower weight classes historically, Salvador Sanchez, in a fight that was basically pegged as a pick'em, demolishes and destroys the standout Puerto Rican Wilfredo Gomez 8 rounds rather effortlessly. I mean, it wasn't as he beat him. It was basically effortless. I mean, you just wondered if Wilfredo Gomez actually touched the guy. I mean, this is a guy, Wilfredo Gomez, who had knocked out everyone he fought going into this fight. And he thought at some point the power was going to get to Salvador Sanchez. He couldn't even dent Salvador Sanchez. And basically, Sanchez didn't throw as much as Gomez, but everything he threw, Wilfredo Gomez's face turned inside out. I mean, both of his eyes were swollen, and that was it. And it was kind of down and out. By the time he got up, he collapsed into Padilla's arms, and the fight was over. And we talk about all the all-time great little big men performances, and we always talk about performances of perfection. This certainly fits the bill when you talk about Salvador Sanchez, because Wilfredo Gomez had zero answers. Now, I tell you, this is a guy that just wiped out Lupe Pintor and Carlos Zarate in epic fights. His power took over, and that was it. But he had no power, no strength, or anything for one of the premier skilled fighters of that time in Salvador Sanchez, at least south of the four kings of Leonard Hagler, Hearns, and Duran. Because we talk about do-it-all fighters, that's what Salvador Sanchez was. Now, Wilfredo Gomez, not made out of chopped liver. Don't get me wrong. I mean, Wilfredo Gomez tried everything. He couldn't do anything to Sanchez. And that was the mind-blowing part, because Sanchez was one of the not just clever with his ability to counter, his overall skill, his ability to use the ring and ring generalship. When we talk about the 4 aspects of scoring a fight, Salvador Sanchez was one of the masters, underrated at that time. I mean, he would not let Wilfredo Gomez get off. He even said, "Yeah, he hits hard, but he never hurt me." I mean, yeah, that was true, because a few times Gomez pinned Sanchez against the ropes, he tried to do something, he could never get it done. I mean, Salvador Sanchez just put on a master exhibition of perfection when it comes to the ability to use the ring, the ability to counter, the ability to slip, and of course, the chin that doesn't get talked about enough. And when he hit that point, he started to flirt with that distinction of the best fighter in the world, pound for pound, because he really went up the rankings. Because even before then, his resume was starting to get better and better. We talk about wins, especially over guys like Danny Little Red Lopez, who was a standout. Sanchez just beat the brakes off of him. But it was this fight that took him to a whole new level, especially for the country of Mexico, who basically at that point anointed him of the distinction of the greatest Mexican fighter of all time. And looked like the future was bright for Salvador Sanchez. Now, of course, you have 2 more fights, one against Pat Quadwell, where he won a closer but expected unanimous decision. Of course, it was a letdown from after what happened when he fought Wilfredo Gomez, which was expected, because to go from Wilfredo Gomez to Pat Quadwell, it wasn't necessarily, going to be at that high level. I mean, understood. But Sanchez did enough to get the win. But of course, after that, he got the obliteration of actually a tougher than expected fight with the great Azuma Nelson, in a fight where he had to dig deep, go to the well, go to the bag, got it. The left hook that put Nelson out in the 15th round. And Salvador Sanchez looked like bigger things were headed, because as he was getting better, a rare case of a fighter who was younger and getting better with a resume that was getting better, because he was starting to really fight some of the better fighters. And then I mind you, after the Nelson fight, they were staring at paydays with guys like Alexis Arguello, Eusebio Pedroza, and Hector Camacho, with maybe in a couple years down the line with the showdown with Julio Cesar Chavez and an all-Mexican clash, which would have just blown the roof off whatever stadium those two would have sold out in Mexico. But of course, we know the unfortunate tragedy that happened. He's preparing for a rematch with Juan Laporte. The unfortunate circumstance where he wound up being struck by a train, and the career and life of Sanchez was over at that point. May God rest his soul. But we talk about what he did on this night. Talk about a performance of perfection, because we see a lot of these in sports, especially in boxing. We talk about performance of perfection. Salvador Sanchez delivered it when he just beat up. Beat up a pretty darn good, strong puncher and a durable opponent in Wilfredo Gomez. Made him look like he had no business being in the same ring as him. That should tell you just how great Salvador Sanchez was. And this guy was poised to be better and better had the tragedy not happened, because he had multi-million-dollar paydays all over the place. He was becoming the king of those lighter weight classes, and was going to probably have that distinction of the greatest Mexican fighter of all time sealed, signed, and delivered at that point. No matter whatever happened after that. Because we go from Danny Little Red Lopez to Wilfredo Gomez to Azuma Nelson, and you're staring at Eusebio Pedroza, Alexis Arguello, Hector Camacho, and Julio Cesar Chavez. Well, for my money, he would have been a favorite against all four of those guys, because he was just the complete package. That should tell you how Salvador Sanchez was revered, not just in the country of Mexico, but in the fight game, because he was starting to become a popular figure. And when he beat down Wilfredo Gomez 44 years ago today, he became a globalized name across the boxing landscape. You didn't go flipping through the channels of anything related to boxing, or flip through the news boxing magazines without seeing the name Salvador Sanchez. That's what the fight with Wilfredo Gomez did. And it was unfortunate with a tragedy, because he was going to be better and better. And you could have made a case. This guy could have superseded, maybe in the case of a top 10, top 15 all-time, and we're talking all-time, pound-for-pound great. Because that's what he was looking at, and he was headed in that right direction. Now, his history is still secure. I want to touch on it in the Latino aspect here in a second, because he could have possibly challenged Roberto Duran for that distinction of the greatest Latino fighter of all time. Because when you demolish somebody like this, it wasn't demolished. It was demolished across all the closed circuit waves, the ABC replays. Everyone was watching it, and everyone was eye open and jaw dropped by how he just paintbrushed this guy. The boxing intelligentsia, and even the sports world started to fall in love with Salvador Sanchez, because not only who he was inside the ring, it was just a thing of beauty, but a humble human being, and brought lots of charm outside of it. And that's what made him the standout figure that he was for that time. Just a terrific fighter. It was unfortunate, the tragedy that took place 2 fights after he demolished Wilfredo Gomez, because the guy was headed toward a path like none other, especially in those weight classes, where he might have superseded Willie Pep for the distinction of the greatest featherweight of all time. Some might still give him that distinction, understandably so, but he would have had that locked down. This guy was on a path like none other. I couldn't even think of fighters with that kind of a resume or that kind of a potential staring at him, because it was already trending up, and he was trending up fast, and he was going to go faster, because Pedroza, Camacho, Arguello, and Chavez were more likely going to be within the next 3 to 4 years had the tragedy not happened. So, unfortunate for Salvador Sanchez, as always for him, may God rest that soul. But for Wilfredo Gomez, he did manage to win a couple world titles. Granted, one of them was under Don King politics, when he somehow got a decision over Rocky Lockridge in a fight that he had no business getting. He did manage to regain a featherweight title before he got pulverized by Azuma Nelson in his own backyard. But after this, the warrior that we knew, Wilfredo Gomez, the one that showed no fear against anyone, and that beating started to show as his career started to go on. Of course, this chronicled substance abuse didn't help either, but still managed to win a couple more world titles. But he never got remotely close to what he was before the Sanchez fight, and he was knocking on the door for, just like Sanchez, to be an all-time great Latino fighter. Now, some give him the distinction of the greatest Puerto Rican fighter of all time, but Wilfredo Benitez might have something to say about that. But he never got to that point, even though he did manage to win a couple world titles. Granted, one of them was gift wrapped, but to get to that point, he never even come remotely close ever again. And when you get a beat down like that, the way he did, and when you get, we see this in the sport, when you get beat down, you don't know what's going through a guy's psyche. Even though Wilfredo Gomez was winning fights, what he was before the Sanchez fight and after the Sanchez fight was totally different. And even though he was still, he was still winning, really the real big fights he had, one of them he got obliterated by Azuma Nelson, and another one he got gift wrapped against Rocky Lockridge. That was basically slowly but surely coming to an end for him. Now, his battles outside the ring didn't help, substance abuse, divorces, among many other things. But a standout Puerto Rican fighter, and just like Mexico has their own deep tradition of great fighters, so too did Puerto Rico. And Wilfredo Gomez's name is right there with him. And probably top 5 of that country. We talk about great Puerto Rican fighters. I could throw a boatload over here like Felix Trinidad, Hector Camacho, Edwin Rosario. Go back to a guy like Carlos Ortiz. Maybe some more modern ones like a Miguel Cotto. But Wilfredo Gomez, probably the top of the heap, right there with Wilfredo Benitez for that Puerto Rican distinction. Now, we're talking about a lot of the rivalry between Mexico and Puerto Rico. Let me just remind people, when these two countries go at it, it's almost like, think of it like World League soccer. I mean, the international flavor and the deeper passion two international countries have we talk about soccer or maybe Olympics, when you have deep followers of your own country rooting you on at the land's highest moments. Boxing's version of this was Mexico versus Puerto Rico, and there's a lot of good ones, a lot of standout ones. I mean, I mentioned Sanchez and Gomez. That's one of the pillars of it because of the insane buildup and craze that was going on with both countries and all the dueling salsa bands that went on during the ring walks. I mean, Julio Cesar Chavez against Edwin Rosario was one because that had built up. It was Chavez's lightweight debut against a hard-punching Rosario, who was just like a Gomez, had all kinds of power, and many thought he was going to handle Chavez, but Chavez just bum-rushed Rosario effortlessly in 11 rounds. You talk about maybe a super event, Oscar De La Hoya versus Felix Trinidad. Even though De La Hoya was Mexican-American per se, the Mexican apparently accepted him for this particular event versus Trinidad, who was a Puerto Rican. Granted, the fight wasn't all that great, but in terms of the Mexican-Puerto Rican sell, it sold pretty darn good for that time at the back end of the 90s. Actually, I'm going to go back a little bit. We talk about Edwin Rosario, his two fights with Jose Luis Ramirez. We talk about Mexico-Puerto Rico. After the tragedy of Salvador Sanchez, they were trying to find a hero in the Mexican-Puerto Rican rivalry. Ramirez gave Rosario everything he could handle in the first fight and shocked the world when he upset Rosario in his own backyard after being dropped 3 times. The two fights, Rosario and Ramirez, stand out in the Mexican-Puerto Rican rivalry, and that definitely is up there with the rest of them. Of course, a little bit past it was Julio Cesar Chavez and Hector Camacho, although that was more of a Chavez showcase because Camacho was past it, but he still had somewhat of a Puerto Rican following, which still made the Chavez-Camacho event a good sell. Maybe go more modern, the two fights between Antonio Margarito and Miguel Cotto. Of course, we know the brouhaha with Antonio Margarito when he was caught with the hand wraps against Shane Mosley. Of course, that leads to all kinds of suspicions for Margarito, especially from the Puerto Rican side of it, because they still think Margarito's 2 wins were asterisked because of what took place. I mean, the first win, let me back up. The first win in 2008, when Margarito won the fight, but the hand wraps he was caught with, that's always going to be talked about. And people from the Puerto Rican side think that win was tainted. Of course, Cotto gets his revenge by just destroying Margarito's eye. And of course, it doesn't help Margarito's cause that his career has been a fraud since he was caught with those wraps prior to the Shane Mosley fight. And of course, we're speaking of Miguel Cotto, the one in 2012 against Canelo Alvarez. It's always going to be a sell, Mexico versus Puerto Rico. Juan Manuel Lopez versus Orlando Salido. Of course, that's always going to be a good sell because Mexico-Puerto Rico. Lots of them in this Mexican-Puerto Rican rivalry. It's always whenever you have this kind of rivalry, regardless of the type of event, it could be an undercard or a main event, it can be one that everyone talks about or no one talks about. Everyone will always get fixated to the Hispanic rivalry that is Mexico versus Puerto Rico. And we talk about Salvador Sanchez versus Wilfredo Gomez. It's one of the pillars of it because of the buzz that surrounded around this event, as well as the two countries involved. Now, of course, Gomez himself has a couple against Mexican fighters, Carlos Zarate and Lupe Pintor. Actually, I would recommend watching the fight with Pintor because Gomez Pintor was just an absolute firefight with both guys just throwing it all out there. Pintor just gets gassed out at the end. But Gomez Pintor was a Mexican-Puerto Rican war. And we talk about fights that are wars in those two countries. The face of it was Wilfredo Gomez and Lupe Pintor. That was before Sanchez demolished Gomez. But when we talk about the deep passion of the Mexican-Puerto Rican rivalry, it's always second to none. It's like international rivalries when we talk about with soccer, even international, even FIBA leagues in basketball or international countries with all the cheering that goes on, all the music and all the crazy things that goes on with those. That's what the Mexican-Puerto Rican rivalry is in the sport of boxing, because it's something deeper. It goes to the root, to the core in ways like none other, down to the heart. And that's how the Mexican-Puerto Rican rivalry is. And every time we get a Mexican-Puerto Rican fight, regardless of the circumstance, it's always going to be a big draw, especially to the Latino community. And we talk about the Latino community and some of the standout fighters, especially from those two countries and some of the others like South America or Panama. Salvador Sanchez and Wilfredo Gomez are two of your top 10. And to me, it's not even close. I mean, they're up there. I mean, the only one I put ahead of Salvador Sanchez is Roberto Duran. That speaks for itself. We talk about Roberto Duran, the greatest lightweight of all time, how he beat Ray Leonard in Montreal in 80 to win the welterweight title. Of course, after No Mas, managed to win 2 more world titles against Davey Moore and Iran Barkley. Gave Marvin Hagler the toughest fight of his career in 83 at that point. He's probably number one. You can make a case for Sanchez. Number 2, maybe slightly behind him, is another fighter who was just beautiful to watch, Alexis Arguello out of Nicaragua, multiple division world champ. The charm and the professionalism that Arguello displayed, and that just wowed the boxing intelligentsia, just as beautiful as Sanchez was. And of course, as I said, Sanchez and Arguello were likely going to have a clash after, Sanchez beat Gomez, but the unfortunate tragedy happened. But Arguello is a top 3 Latino fighter from that community from Nicaragua. Julio Cesar Chavez, some point have him the distinction of the greatest Mexican fighter of all time. I don't have a problem with it. He's up there. I mean, the record speaks for itself. 5 world titles in 3 weight classes, the demolition of Edwin Rosario, the dramatic comfort behind knockout of Meldrick Taylor, and demoralizing fighters like Jose Luis Ramirez and Hector Camacho along the way. He's up there. Felix Trinidad from Puerto Rico. I mean, 5 titles in 3 weight classes, one of the longer reigns in welterweight championship history. Had a brief, but darn good run at junior middleweight when he obliterated Fernando Vargas and David Reed. And of course, tried his luck at middleweight, won a belt before he lost to Bernard Hopkins, but he's still a top, Latino fighter. We talk about from the country of Puerto Rico. We can trace back to before them guys like Ruben Olivares of Mexico, Carlos Ortiz of Puerto Rico. I mentioned Wilfredo Gomez, his countryman Wilfred Benitez, the youngest who won a world title at the time, but bizarre reasons was never officially crowned it. And you go on to the list goes on and on, real deep. I mean, Lupe Pintor from Mexico is another. You can talk about Eder Joffre from south of the border, one of the little big men. We talk about bantamweights. Humberto Chiquita Gonzalez out of Mexico. The 3 exciting fights with Michael Carbajal. He's up there. But the deep tradition of Latino fighters and the deep greatness, there's always something extra special. It's been said a lot of times. There's always something extra special. We can see the pure greatness of Latino fighters, especially some of the ones I mentioned, because there's a rare case of not just the elite level skill you see, but the will and determination that separates them from a lot of the ones we see with some of the common names. I mean, some of the names I got to throw out there: Eric Morales, Marco Antonio Barrera, Juan Manuel Marquez. Who can forget that 4-fight series of Manny Pacquiao, where at times it looked like Pacquiao was going to overwhelm him, but Marquez just hung tough. And of course, Ricardo Finito Lopez, 4 more others from the country in Mexico. They're also in that conversation as well. We talk about some of the other ones from stand out from Puerto Rico. Of course, Wilfredo Vasquez Sr. I think bantamweight, super bantamweight, and featherweight. Very cagey fighter. Gave exciting fights during his time. Go all the way back to a light heavyweight named Jose Torres. Before Customato discovered Mike Tyson and even Floyd Patterson. The first project of Customato was Jose Torres. Google it. Esteban de Jesus, who can forget his trilogy with Duran back in the 70s to clean out the lightweight division. They needed a third fight to determine the undisputed champion. Duran needed de Jesus to get it, but it's not a slouch on de Jesus. He was a problem during those days. Roberto Duran could tell you inside out about that one. Samuel Serrano, a couple division world champion. One longtime cruiserweight champ, Carlos De Leon, who once fought Evander Holyfield. And many fighters go along from Puerto Rico as well as the ones in Mexico. Just a deep, passionate tradition like none other. And one of the pillars of that tradition took place 44 years ago today, at probably his finest hour, at the night that put him among the all-time greats. From Mexico, Salvador El Chava Sanchez demolished, and I mean demolished, the tough, durable Puerto Rican Wilfredo Gomez in 8 rounds to retain his featherweight championship, and a performance of perfection, a beating of perfection, to where nobody could recognize what Wilfredo Gomez was after the fight, because after the second or third round, Wilfredo Gomez's face was just it. Turned inside out, the counter-punching, the ring generalship, the precision, the beauty of Salvador Sanchez was just magnificent on this night. And this is one of those fights I call it a performance of perfection, because Salvador Sanchez delivered one of those against a very, very tough and great Wilfredo Gomez. Sanchez left nothing to doubt on this night. I mean, it's unfortunate of the tragedy of Sanchez, because, I mean, the scary thing was, and this is the wild thing with him, as I said, he was trending up. He was climbing up those pound-for-pound rankings. He could have easily had the distinction of the best of that era, because he had at multi-million-dollar paydays with massive names after that. And he probably would have been favored against any of those guys. I mean, Pedrosa, forget it. Sanchez wipes the ring with him. I mean, Camacho, depending on what Hector Camacho shows up, but even then, Sanchez beats him. Alexis Arguello, hell of a fight, but, maybe Arguello was a bit on his downturn at that point, but I'd probably favor Sanchez, a terrific fight. And you would have had an all-Mexican showdown between Salvador Sanchez and Julio Cesar Chavez some point in the early to mid-'80s, because Chavez's career just started when Sanchez started to hit his peak. And after Sanchez had the tragedy, Chavez started to make his range in the super featherweight division. And, those two would have clashed at some point. And, that Mexico would have built it up and found a way to surpass at least 150,000 at one of those stadiums over there, which knows how to pack a house, because that's what Salvador Sanchez was headed toward. It had not been for the unfortunate tragedy and the unfortunate killing. And to show you how revered Salvador Sanchez is, Wilfredo Gomez was one of the 5 men who traveled from Puerto Rico to Mexico on the day that of Salvador Sanchez's funeral, which was televised worldwide on ABC's Wide World of Sports, to pay his respects to just a terrific fighter and a terrific human being, because that's what Salvador Sanchez was. And it speaks to the respect he got from the boxing community, especially from a standout like Wilfredo Gomez. Says a lot. We go cross country to put differences aside for a rival, something like that. And that's how revered and respected Salvador Sanchez was. Wilfredo Gomez was just phenomenal. I mean, the footage is out there. You watch him. I mean, the guy was just a machine at times, but when that machine was soft, it had to be something special to beat Wilfredo Gomez during that time. Salvador Sanchez was special. And it's unfortunate of the tragedy, because he was headed toward not just greatness, what I would call pure greatness, because we talk about greatness in boxing these days. Greatness can mean a lot of things. But Salvador Sanchez took no shortcuts. He wanted to fight the best at their best, and that's why he took the fight with Wilfredo Gomez and just demolished and wiped him out. And to show the world why he was the man at that time, at least in the country of Mexico, at least in the featherweight division. because he was it. I mean, he was going to have a rematch, I believe, with Juan Laporte, which he would have demolished him like he did the first time. So he would have gone up. At that point, he would have had to gone up because the featherweight division was done. I mean, who was left there? I mean, Eusebio Pedrosa was about to move up, and Sanchez would have wiped the ring with him. There's no doubt about it. But what if we talk about phenoms? Salvador Sanchez was a phenom. He was the one that captivated the global boxing audience, not just in Mexico or the Latin American community, all over the world, especially here in the States. He became a box office hit, and when he sold out the indoor pavilion of Caesar's Palace when he obliterated Gomez, that should tell you just how iconic Salvador Sanchez was. May God rest his soul. And that'll wrap up this edition of Sir Hunt on X. I will be back after the weekend. I will be bringing on my NFL preview show Monday night. And as always, if you missed any part of this show, you can catch it on the Apple Podcast, iHeartRadio, and Spotify apps, as audio versions will be uploaded after this one. And as always, make self-care your number one priority in life. Always take care of yourself first before you take care of anything else. If you take care of yourself first, all the good things come your way. If you don't take care of yourself first, nothing else in life matters. Have a good rest of the night. Take care of yourselves. God bless. Enjoy the day and weekend. I will see you Monday.